So for our second speaker today, we've got Dano Morrison. Dano Morrison is a student of neuroscience who's working out of the University of British Columbia. I met Dano when he was one of the first really inspired and passionate members of the UBC Life Extension Club, which we ended up working on together because Dano became the vice president, in the second year of the club's existence. We actually have another member of the UBC Life Extension Club here too today, which is awesome. And without further ado, I'll give it away to Dano. So everybody, thank you. All right.
Hey guys. So Hans introduced the idea of the 50% of variability in Alzheimer's risk that we can control with our lifestyle. And he talked a lot about that. I'm going to go onto that topic a little more and a little in depth into what are some really implementable strategies that we could kind of add on to whatever we're currently doing. And specifically, I'm focusing on the idea of what we can do with our brains. The idea of cognitive exercise and how the challenging of our brains, the use of our brains in our everyday life can maybe contribute to a preventative effect against cognitive decline. So, as a general interest, we should all be sharing is like one of wanting to extend our lifespans. And central to that is, the preservation of our brain and our cognitive functions throughout our life. We want to be as sharp as possible so we can live as long as possible. And unfortunately, a lot of us are going to experience some decline in those mental faculties as we get older. There's also a high incidence of Alzheimer's that might affect us. 1 in 11 Canadians seem to suffer from Alzheimer's disease at some point in life. And of course, if we're developing technology to extend the lifespan of our bodies, keep our bodies healthy, we want to make sure we're around to enjoy it. We don't want to lose any aspect of ourselves that, makes us who we are, which is the most tragic thing to me about Alzheimer's is how one kind of deteriorates from within. So that's bad, and we want to prevent that. But so generally, aging in the brain starts to take place after the 20s is kind of the current understanding. There's a decline in fluid intelligence, which is generally your IQ, your memory, your ability to reason, figure things out. So that declines after a certain age, very slowly, while other things like your general life wisdom will increase, which is nice. But these decreases in working memory and processing speed are something we'd like to avoid. And this is measured clinically with the diagnoses of Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment or preclinical Alzheimer's. Basically, people who function at a normal level, once they dip below some certain threshold, then they're diagnosed with MCI. And then once again, if they dip even farther down, then they're diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Because Alzheimer's isn't something, at least now, that we can diagnose biologically in someone who's living. Usually the diagnosis is given once they just become demented enough, and then after the fact, when they autopsy the brain, that's when they identify all the pathology. So, research looking into dementia risk and what causes Alzheimer's has really kind of created some interesting leads. There's a lot of factors in lifestyle that seem to be associated with decreased risk of Alzheimer's. Primary to that is education. That's a really big one. Also, things like engaging leisure activities in older life. People have more free time, kind of paradoxically almost seem to, be more engaged and suffer less from cognitive decline, especially if those activities are like, intellectually stimulating. There's a good Italian study that showed that old people who played board games did better. Also, like reading and doing puzzles and being parts of like social groups is really effective as well. Also, there's some association between people with intellectually stimulating careers, or people that at least seem to be doing kind of mentally demanding things every day. And also an interesting protective effect of IQ. So looking at childhood IQ, those with greater IQ at like age 11 actually have delayed onset of Alzheimer's. And that brings up an interesting idea, which I'm going to go into, which is maybe, if you start, like I said, the diagnoses are made when declines in function go past a certain threshold. If you're starting from higher up, then maybe you've got longer to fall before you reach a state where you can't function. And that kind of generally is the idea of cognitive reserve. which is a huge theory in the kind of dementia literature right now. The idea that cognitive reserve is the capacity of our brains to deal with the accumulation of age-related damage. And cognitive reserve could either be structural or kind of psychological or cognitive is the two kind of ways people theorize about it. The first way is if you have maybe a denser, thicker, larger brain, maybe more intelligence arises from greater brain complexity, then you have more neurons, more synapses to start with, and you've got more to lose before you go below a certain point. The other cool idea is that people with greater cognitive reserve are able to compensate for loss of function by using alternative cognitive strategies. Maybe compensating for loss of function in certain brain areas, certain brain networks by using other brain networks. And that seems to be what the research has shown. So this was a really cool study that I believe was done fairly recently. This is activity measured via brain oxygenation in Alzheimer's patients while they're doing a working memory task. And so all these people demonstrate the same clinical level of impairment. They all have Alzheimer's disease. They're all functioning, and I think they're all doing just about the same on this working memory task. But they're different in how much education they have, and the activation of their brains while they try to solve these problems is vastly different. The more educated people have less activity in the temporal lobes, the middle area there, where memory function, where working memory is actually, where activation normally lights up when people try to solve these problems. So they have less activation there, which suggests that there's possibly an accumulation of Alzheimer's pathology. They're suffering from, impairments in that network, and they're less able to draw on it, compared to less educated people who seem to have more normal levels of neuronal activity in that memory region. Interestingly, the people in the educated group also have more activity in their prefrontal areas, kind of an alternate, non-typical network for solving these types of problems, which suggests that maybe they're compensating for deficits in that working memory, like that memory system, by kind of over-firing in their prefrontal areas. So this is the basic idea that I kind of want to focus on: cognitive reserve, the ability of our brains to withstand age-related damage versus maybe just growth of more neurons and synapses, and also familiarity, like a biological familiarity, a plasticity that allows the brain to tap into alternate systems of function in order to solve problems. So later down the road, when certain parts of the brain become impaired, the brain with lots of cognitive reserve is able to compensate for those losses of function. Now, what can we do to build up that cognitive reserve? It's associated with education and engaged occupations in the epidemiological literature. So it just suggests that exercising our brains, applying ourselves and stimulating ourselves every day can lead to growth. But aside from doing something big like changing a career or trying to enter a new social circle, what can we do that's convenient and supplementable to try to increase our cognitive reserve? First the basics, and I'll come back to these. Like Hans addressed, some of the most basic things we can do to prevent Alzheimer's is the things that everyone already knows: physical exercise every day, a good diet, a healthy social network, continuous learning throughout the life, and an engaged career that gives self-efficacy and lots of mental stimulation. But since maybe we're already there as a group, and we're kind of interested in the more boutique supplementable approaches, I'm going to go into that. So first is brain training software, which has exploded in the last couple of years. I think all of you should recognize this annoying girl. she's from YouTube. Yeah. So there's all these softwares out there kind of promoting the idea that you can just do these simple games. They're really convenient and they're kind of fun and they're very brightly colored. And if you do those over time, they'll stimulate the brain and they'll lead to improvements in cognition and possibly even protect the brain against age-related damage. So there's a lot of controversy in the literature over these, but luckily there's been a review paper that came out this year that I'm a big fan of, that goes through all this work, identifies poor studies, grabs the few high-quality studies, and then makes conclusions about it. Those studies that weren't suffering from lacks of proper controls or randomization seem to tell the story that training in these kinds of games does lead to improvement in cognition, but those improvements are only in areas that are really closely related to the type of training that was done. So training in a working memory task like dual and back will lead to improvements in verbal memory and visual spatial memory tasks. And it's also kind of important to know that the way they measure those aspects of function are games that are very similar to how they train people in these games. And so someone's improved performance on a verbal memory and a visual spatial task, and so it's like, okay, that's good, but it's kind of unknown how much that translates to real life. But there do seem to be improvements in those closely targeted areas. Those improvements don't last forever, though. When they follow up with people after like 3 months or 9 months, they seem to return to baseline. But that's not entirely unexpected. I mean, that's almost just like physical exercise. If you don't, work out for a couple months, you might see your benefits go away. And similarly, if you work your arms all the time, you shouldn't expect to see improvements in your leg strength. So, smart brain training to me would be specifically targeting areas that you think you are weak in, realizing that you might only see benefits in those closely related areas, and then maintaining consistent practice in order to maintain those benefits. There's also been kind of an alternate push of research into using brain training to train people with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's, and those have been somewhat more promising. There's been a lot of effective studies showing that people are starting to see memory loss, and that's interfering with their ability to remember their keys and remember their kids' names. If they practice memory tasks, then they can actually improve quite strongly on those aspects of function, and they will translate very well into improvement in everyday life. And a lot of that might be due to kind of remediation of some decline that they've already had. So do they help prevent cognitive decline? Maybe. There's these promising findings, but then again, no one has really done a large-scale randomized clinical trial, which would be really nice, where you get people to consistently practice and then watch how their incidence to Alzheimer's is affected by training. Also, really quickly, I want to talk about video games, because I got interested in seeing some papers related to this while searching through the literature. There was kind of a funny wave of papers published in the mid-90s treating elderly people with video games like Super Mario and Tetris and stuff, try to see if it made them smarter and better functioning. And they all were really positive. They weren't the best studies. They didn't have any control group. It was just go to the senior home, test the people, give them Super Mario, and test them again. But then there was a Nature paper that came out, I think 3 years ago, that went to an elderly home, did the same kind of thing, but a very proper study. They played this real-time strategy game, Rise of Nations, where if anyone's ever played an RTS like StarCraft, it's pretty cognitively demanding, because you have to be aware of what's going on in your base and the enemy's base, and planning and keeping all these different things in mind and making different executive functions. And that's exactly what they saw improve, was these people's ability to be aware of multiple things and switch between multiple areas to make decisions. And that's very cool, because it also showed an improvement in their general everyday function. So that's kind of the state of the research on brain training right now. There's some promising results, although if you look at everything that's been found in the scientific literature, some of the claims made on the websites are a bit grandiose. Perhaps we could introduce them into our lives as a way to stimulate and challenge our brains, but then again, we shouldn't look for any miracles. Another thing that I'm really interested in and I want to talk about is meditation as a form of cognitive exercise. Because essentially, at least in the way I understand it. That's what meditation is. In the brain, meditation seems to activate or lead to the activation of certain brain areas involved in kind of positive cognitive processes like attention, concentration, self-regulation, and self-awareness. This graphic up in the top right is fairly complex, but there's a researcher at Harvard Medical School who has kind of mapped out all the different brain areas that are activated by meditation, the different types of meditation, and how he thinks they play a role in the types of psychological processes that occur during meditation. And so areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is kind of involved in goal-directed attention. So the decision that you make that you're going to pay attention to your breath or your body sensations for the next little while, that seems to be mediated largely by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that lights up during meditation. And also, over time, over frequent meditation daily for a number of years, those same areas that are activated increase in size, which is cool, which suggests that neuroplasticity, some kind of activity-dependent growth, is being triggered by this repetitive activation, and that's leading to these structural changes. Beyond just increases in brain size, there's also increases in white matter connectivity. So the axonal fiber tracts in the brain that carry information between disparate regions. The density of those fibers seems to be increased, suggesting that the brains of long-term meditators can process information more quickly. And those structural changes suggest and have been linked to increases in improvement of the areas of those areas and regions of the brain underlie. So long-term meditation has been associated with improved attention, improved emotional regulation, and possibly improved working memory and executive function, suggesting that this is something we can use to train our brains, possibly by activating certain networks that are important for psychological function, like the frontoparietal control network involved in maintaining attention, and the hippocampal cortical memory network that is involved in memory retrieval and self-awareness, which I'm going to go into next. So the idea of cognitive reserve is that we can compensate for loss of function in certain brain areas by activating alternate pathways. Could meditation do this? Well, there was a study that looked at the brains of long-term meditation. Oh, no, actually, it took MCI patients who were suffering from mild cognitive impairment, those same people who kind of saw decreases in activity of their memory networks, their hippocampuses when they were trying to do memory tasks, and trained them on meditation. They saw increased connectivity in those areas that were suffering from deficits with a long-term practice, suggesting that that practice led to improvements in those areas and increased function, possibly through activity-dependent neuroplasticities. So that graphic is kind of an illustration of that really important memory area, basically where the hippocampus, where memories are more or less stored. Perhaps the hippocampus is the index for memory, is one of the theories, and the prefrontal cortex, where the seat of cognition is and executive searching. So meditation seems to possibly increase the function of certain areas. The other cool thing about meditation is, depending on the type of meditation you do, you could focus on certain cognitive functions, like love and kindness meditation, which is based on empathy and connection with other people, activates different areas of the brain than concentrated focus meditation, which is mainly the networks of goal-directed attention. So those seem to be the two most boutique strategies and effective strategies, at least in my research, is meditation and brain training. I put the focus more on meditation just because of its benefits across the life, not only to prevent cognitive decline and build cognitive reserve, but also to possibly lead to a happier and more fulfilled life as we learn to regulate ourselves better and appreciate the world around us a little bit more intimately. So to quickly finish off, just to reiterate what I've gone through, the key to building cognitive reserve seems to be, and the key to keeping the brain healthy seems to be using it, lest you lose it. Once again, the variability in Alzheimer's is somewhere around 50%. The 50% genetic thing, that's kind of, that can be kind of sad in a way, the fact that a lot of our fate is chained to our genes. But the good news is that 50% of that risk we can control. And possibly by doing these strategies, meditating, training the brain, physical exercise, and continuing to seek out learning opportunities, we can give ourselves the best fighting chance against age-related cognitive decline. Now, these strategies might only kind of build up, allow ourselves to push the clock back a little bit farther. So, hopefully at some point we can understand the physiological processes underlying aging and tackle those directly. But until then, we got to do the best we can and try to, build up our brains in order to fight those icy clutches of dementia coming to get us. So, meditation seems to induce positive structural and cognitive changes. I also forgot to mention it's a good tool for decreasing stress, which is also related to, mental illness and Alzheimer's. Training the brain in a smart, consistent way, seeking out opportunities to challenge yourself. Continued education decreases the relationship between Alzheimer's and the amount of years that you live statistically, and also physical exercise is totally beneficial for the whole body and the brain as well. And that's where I'd like to leave it. So you use it or lose it. Thank you.
As before, if anybody has questions, I hope you've got lots.
Luke?
I have one. So, looking at other aspects of longevity, we've seen there's studies on different populations around the world. I just wondered if you've ever seen anything, if anyone's looking for, if there's populations in the world that have lower levels of dementia or retain their cognitive function into older age. If you've ever seen anything?
I actually can't think of anything off the top of my head looking at that.
There's going to be some correlation between living a long time and being healthy
and
maintaining your mental function, but
besides the diet factors, I think I wouldn't be surprised if all the blue zone people also showed decreased incidence of Alzheimer's as well. There was also a lot of research on the groups of people who got Alzheimer's way earlier, and then that allowed them to locate like the ApoE4 genes and that kind of relationship. But I can't think of anything that specifically points to like a behavioral kind of effect epidemiologically, just based on a certain area or group of people.
You would expect maybe India to have that kind of positive tendency just because of yoga practice. Yoga practice has meditation integrated into it.
Yeah, actually India, they have very low Alzheimer's. They think it's the, turmeric is one thing. They think it's curcumin consumption is contributing
Free
to
yoga.
Yeah, interesting.
I was intrigued by this idea of, in training, focusing on your areas of weakness. And I know one of my areas of weakness is the ability to multitask when I'm focusing on something, also being aware of other things. Do you have any ideas about how you could train that sort of capacity?
Well, multitasking is really controversial right now because it seems to be just really rapid switching. Because we know the brain can't really actually multitask the way that we kind of conceive of it as lay people. So, perhaps attention-based meditation would be good for that. Although that's
I find the problem is if I'm attending to something, then I ignore everything else that I'm not attending to.
Yeah.
And that's something that it seems other people are better at than me.
I mean, it sounds like StarCraft might be.
No, when you were talking about RTS,
Yeah, exactly.
I should go back to playing
That was
StarCraft.
actually the question I was going to ask. Was I'd never heard of that study before with, and obviously those were people in some state of cognitive decline. But maybe we've gotten it all wrong that the whole ADD nation and the idea that the rates of attention deficit disorder are on the rise, and it's all about those television shows and video games. But if they were to try and replicate that study in young persons,
Yeah.
control versus attention deficit, maybe they find it's actually the opposite. More video games would help, at least with things like executive function, which is one of the more long-term difficulties. That
Yeah, it's a trade-off. I think the most important thing about that study is that those people were working their brains in ways that they never did anymore.
Mhm.
I mean, they were in such kind of like a poor environment that they weren't ever engaged in that kind of like crazy multitasking activity of a video game. I think that was the key thing.
Mhm.
You probably wouldn't see an effect on kids just because we're already, just like filled with so much stimulation. We're already kind of in that environment already. Like Hans said, it's really about, in that quilting study, the photography study, it's all about something like totally new. Like putting your brain in a totally new environment to allow it to adapt and kind of develop new ways to work with like demands on it. Oh,
Sorry.
yeah. Yeah, in the back first, then.
This is a two-part question. First of all, just to get the assumptions right, I know that the brain training evidence is weak. However, there is going to be some variance in who benefits and who doesn't, even
Mhm.
within a single study that has a null result.
Yeah.
My question is, are these studies necessary for me to evaluate whether brain training works for me? And if I'm just trying to test if I'm a part of the upper end on that variance, like, oh, okay, it works for me, how would I go about structuring that experiment to figure that out?
That's a really good question. That's a good idea for like a whole other project. Now, like the evidence seems to show that the near target domains seem to be most improved. So if you intelligently structured your training in a certain way, I'd say the best thing would be identify what your cognitive weaknesses are, identify the training that's going to address that, and then test that consistently and in a really smart way around that area of function. And maybe even find a way to try to test how that cognitive ability kind of plays out in your everyday life.
Yeah.
But then again, you don't have the element of like a proper control, which is...
Yeah, I mean, that was actually the one thing when you said like a smart way. Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What counts as a smart way? Like,
Yeah.
the problem with a lot of these training activities is that the training is the measurement.
Yeah.
So I don't know, unless you're... I always wondered how much training does it take before I nullify practice effects and everything else is just me either using the training as a measurement for a different intervention or me seeing if the training made another part of my life better. Do you know how long it takes before a practice effect is nullified, or do I just have to wait 3 months before I get back to baseline and then test again?
See if you can beat your top score every time.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not too sure about...
score video game.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about the timeline of this. Most of these like studies that did show improvements were
Yeah.
training less than 3 weeks. So I think you're looking at like a total, if you do a total training time of like less than 20 hours, around then you should maybe start to see actual improvements in other areas.
That was the dual impact training, that wasn't it?
I think so. Some of the Yagi study.
These studies, like I haven't looked at these studies, but are they trying to make you smarter or are they trying to prevent decline?
Most of these are looking at making people smarter.
It depends on the study and the study's effectiveness.
Yeah, it's either making healthy people smarter or like remediating cognitive deficits in cognitively impaired people. No one's really bridged the gap except for a couple studies that are dubious, to say the least. Yeah, but that's really interesting. I think that's something that the club as a whole would be kind of interested in addressing. Like,
I'll
how
work
can
on it
we-
for everyone.
Yeah, we should have a discussion about that.
And like, for brain training, how much do you have to meditate per day and how much brain training do you have to do?
Oh, I saw it. I would say for brain training, there was actually a Lumosity ran kind of an internal study looking at how much people progressed in their tests based on how much they practiced per day. And there was an effect that it said actually doing it every day isn't the best. The people who got the most efficient increases were doing it, I think, every other day, at least 17 minutes a day. So it's not even that big of a burden. It could probably be just like 3 hours a week. Maybe every couple of days you just come and do a half an hour training session. It seems to be a good time frame. As for meditation, I think more is better. There was one study that showed improvements with just 20 minutes a day. But of course, if you get involved in a practice, a lot of the instructions are to do it for at least an hour a day.
Has anybody looked at the timing of combining the exercise with the brain training? I mean, I guess I'm thinking of my example. When I was in school, I would go for swimming in the morning, and
Yeah.
go to class.
Yeah.
And my morning classes, I got a lot more out of than my afternoon ones.
Yeah. So combining physical exercise and mental exercise.
But trying to get the timing to work.
Yeah. No, I wish I remembered the details, but I did see a paper that people were doing on that. I think it was one of those low-mosity internal studies or something. And combining them seemed to be a good idea. I think it led to increased improvements in the mental exercising training and also possibly the rate at which people developed improvements. So that's a great idea. If you could time it that way, you could also time it to be early in the morning. That's the best.
Yeah. It's interesting with the idea of like these luminosity studies. It kind of makes one think of like people who are athletic trainers. To at least allow their trainer exercise group muscles, at least allow 48 hours between repetitions, so that way they don't overtrain.
Yeah.
They don't over traumatize or overtax their regenerative abilities. And is it possible that the brain has similar mechanisms like that? Like it's possible to overtrain
to
themselves?
overtrain the brain, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I think. I mean, there was I think we've all been there, when we're cramming for exams and stuff. And you just hit that wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably something. And then there's also the whole stress factor as well.
Mm.
I think it's possible. Eva, you have a question.
First of all, I'd like to make a comment on the ADD. I have been told that I have a low level of ADD, and it affects females differently than males. In that, in females, the brain is overactive, and we tend not to hear things that other people are talking about partway into the conversation because our brain starts flicking on other things that are connected to that. We're overstimulated. But I have found that not having caffeine really lowers that problem. So it's not just a maybe damage to the brain, but it can also be related to nutrition. That's just something I've experienced for myself. The other thing is, since the 70s, I've done meditation on and off, different forms. And recently I've started trying Dispenza's meditation program, and I'm going into the second week of that. And I'm finding it very effective. But have you run across any studies on the type of meditation that works best for a Western population?
There's very few studies that actually compare meditation types. Usually, the story is there's a neuroscientist, a researcher gets in touch with a guru or a teacher, and there's almost like an exclusivity bias in their studies, and that's kind of a problem that maybe needs to be addressed. I can't think of anything that compares different types. Although there is stuff that compares meditation versus relaxation training, kind of like non-meditative relaxation training, and in all cases, the meditation seems to be better. Seems a bit better. I think there's an element of challenge and exercise into it, which meditation certainly is. So
the studies that you referred to in your presentation, what kind of meditation are they referring to?
It's kind of different types, but mostly they break them down because regardless of where the meditation tradition really comes from, meditation can either be like a concentrative meditation or like a mindfulness, open awareness meditation. And so they usually make that distinction. And usually they're focusing on mindfulness meditation, which is like meditating with kind of an awareness of what's going on around you, either inside or outside of the body, as opposed to just trying to hone out everything else while you focus in on a certain point. And that type of meditation seems to be really important for self-awareness. This is a cool idea that I think is really interesting. That the areas of the brain involved in self-awareness mediate lower level stuff like breathing and body sensation, but are also very closely physically related to the areas of the brain that are involved in self-awareness of emotional states and mental structures. So training through mindfulness meditation, those self-awareness regions, I believe leads to kind of bleed over effects into like self-awareness of emotions and thoughts. And thus people are better able to regulate and be aware of those and remove, maladaptive habits of reactivity to those phenomenon. And that's the type of meditation that seems to lead to like effectiveness for depression and anxiety. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Just from my own experience or my own learning, it seems that a lot of the meditation traditions sort of treat what you might call concentration meditation or attention meditation as being the primary building block upon which other ones are built. Because the idea being that like a compassion meditation or metta is great for anybody, but if you're better at constraining your focus to a very, very narrow target for longer periods of time, you'll be that much better when you're focusing that attention, that heightened attention on compassion or loving kindness and stuff like that.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, they kind of see it as like a necessary stepping stone for deeper forms of meditation. Jacob, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if the benefits of meditation, if there's like changes in the structure of the brain, if they're maintained any better than the benefits from brain training.
That's a good question, and the research can't really answer that because all the research is like looking at people who've been doing it for years and years, who have like maybe 1,000 hours of meditation practice logged. So
But there's
no
real
real
for people who have stopped meditating.
yeah, there's no relationship. Yeah, looking at people who meditate and then stop, or there's very few even like cohort studies where they kind of cause. There are a couple of those coming out where they give people meditation training, put them in retreats, and then watch changes in the brain. But yeah, you'd have to think that those structural changes would be vulnerable to the same kind of baseline returning effects that you also see in cognition and other aspects of health too.
I wouldn't be surprised if he did it enough, the changes could be permanent. Taxi drivers in the UK, right? They didn't get so larger. That's a pretty noticeable sizable functional change.
Yeah. Well, there is also I don't think I talked about it, but changes in cortical gyrification. The gyri are the folds in the brain, the creases. Those actually there seems to be more folds in the brains of experienced meditators. That sounds like something that'd be kind of hard to reverse. So maybe that's permanent.
Well, especially because it's literally like an increase in the surface area of the brain.
Yeah.
And so I guess conceivably it could shrink back, but yeah. That would be an interesting study.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
Okay.
Pretty good.
Well, yeah.
Oh.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.